Later, Grace, Annie, and Noodle arrived at Warbucks' mansion. Wow, this place is huge. It's as huge as the places I've been to. Well, Annie, you and Noodle are our guests for Christmas, so what do you want to do first? I think I'll start with the walls, then the floor. Annie, I don't think she means doing chores. Noodle's right, Annie. You won't have to lift a single finger. The staff will do it for you. Really? And neither will Noodle. Wow, this is amazing. Someone pinched me. Drake the butler came from behind and pinched her. Ow! Hey! She didn't mean it! But hey, Miss Farrell, why don't you show us around and introduce us to the staff? I'd be delighted to. Grace showed Noodle and Annie around, and everything they saw was absolutely amazing for Annie. While Noodle was used to all the best places, being in the rock star business and all, once Grace had finished showing them around, all of our Warbucks came home. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and welcome home, Mr. Warbucks. How was your flight? Long. We had to land twice. I'm just happy to finally be back and I can get some work done. Mr. Warbucks, this is Annie, the orphan who's staying with us, and her friend Noodle, who volunteers at the orphanage. What? That's the orphan? Orphans are boys. And since when did they allow Chinese women to work with children? What? How could? Oh, right. Noodle remembered that it was the 1930s and that people really weren't not accepting of other races yet. Excuse me, sir, but for your information, I am Japanese and happen to be from Japan, but I was raised in England by my fellow volunteers at the orphanage, and orphans are not just boys, they are also girls. Yes, and sir, you didn't say what you wanted, so I picked a girl. Well, I guess you'll have to do. Well, Annie, since it's you and your friend's first night here, maybe we could take you somewhere. How about a movie? Gee whiz, I've never been to a movie before. Then it's settled. Grace, I'd like you to take Annie and her friend to the movies. Ah, gee, what's wrong? It's just, I thought you were going to take me to a movie. Yeah, and you are supposed to be our host, aren't you? I could, but I'm very busy. At that moment, the phone rang. Grace, could you get that? I'm a very busy man, and I have a lot of work, and I need to keep my factories open. I've already lost 3 to this depression. Mr. Warbucks, it's President Roosevelt. Warbucks took the phone from Grace. Hello, Mr. President. Suddenly, Noodle had an idea. Hey, Annie. Yeah? Noodle then whispered in Annie's ear. Yes, I know, Mr. President. Noodle and Annie then came up to Warbucks. Well, I don't know, but suddenly Annie was making a cute sad face with puppy eyes. Oh, Annie, you poor thing. Well, you can't come by my place tonight. Well, poor Annie. You're too much. Actually, Mr. President, I'm afraid I'm going to have to cancel. I have a date with a young little girl and her Japanese friend. Bye, Mr. President. Warbucks then hung up the phone. All right, I'll come. Drake, get my coat. The 4 then grabbed their coats and drove to the big city known as New York City, where they saw all sorts of places along with street performers until they made it to the theater. By the time the movie was over and they were driving home, Annie had fallen asleep. Warbucks carried her to bed while Grace tucked her in. Meanwhile, across the hall, Noodle was in another room. She was wearing a 1930s-style nightgown looking out the window where the stars were shining bright in the sky, as she seemed to be doing well with Annie, all on her own, but wondered how her bandmates were doing with the other orphans while also dealing with Hannigan. All she could do was think, "Good night, Murdoch. Good night, Russell. Good night, Tootie." Meanwhile, at the orphanage, Russell and Murdoch had already fallen asleep on the small mattress while Tootie was still up, also looking at the stars and wondering about Noodle, knowing she was probably doing well compared to what they had been doing, like helping the orphans and dealing with Hannigan. But he didn't care. As long as the orphans were safe, then Annie was safe with Noodle around. Good night, Noodle.